Stay tuned for Butler on Business, coming up next on the Liberty Express.
If the big spenders get their way, they'll charge everything on your taxpayer's express card, and believe me, they never leave home without it.
Welcome back, and joining us now, I am proud to say, is Dr. Ron Paul, a fella who needs no introduction. Dr. Paul, good morning.
Good morning, Alan. Nice to be with you.
Well, it's nice to be with you, and I'm very appreciative of your time. I know that you've been so busy that the time you're giving me is time you are taking away from something else. So, Dr. Paul, one of the questions I had for you, the information that we get out of the government in these various economic reports is simply not accurate or misleading. And, for example, Charles and I, Goyette, we were talking a week or two ago that the federal budget deficit below $1 trillion, yet they borrowed over $1 trillion. So clearly there's dollars that they're not counting, but is actually money being spent. Am I correct?
Yes, and actually, they do hide a lot. They have off-budget items, but it's actually a lot worse than that because some things, the big things, never even go through the budget. You take, for instance, how many dollars did they churn around and pass out and bail out people, during the major crisis in 2009? I mean, it was trillions and trillions of dollars. Congress had no idea where it came from, where, when, who benefited, and so it makes Congress, really a minor player in all this. So what you hear from the government statistics, it's almost better to just assume that what they tell us is the opposite is the truth. I often said that, when you hear a piece of legislation and they have a fancy title on it, the title to preserve the liberties of the American people. Well, it's probably going to do exactly the opposite. Initially, when they had these financial secrecy laws, bank secrecy laws, they were nothing more than not provide our privacy, but to provide information to the government. So I don't think you can trust the government statistics, and the budget figures are way off. The entitlement obligations are historically high. It's huge, but they don't really talk about that. And if you were in business, you would have to calculate this. Well, we're under the gun for, $70 billion or $70 trillion or something, but that's not even calculated. So, but I think more people are waking up, and this is a healthy thing going on right now, is more and more Americans are becoming skeptical of what they hear from the government, both on the left and the right. So I think that's the beginning of an awakening that will require the government to eventually change.
Well, and then I know one of the things that has disturbed you is inflation. Last week we got a PPI, but just the month earlier they were using a different method to calculate it. And had they calculated the PPI the way they calculated the December PPI, it would have been triple that. Even the PPI is triple what we were told.
And if you go way back, I think in the 90s they had major changes. That CPI is going up probably about 8%, 7 or 8% at least. And that's only part of the story, but they know the markets react to this. Even those in the marketplace who are doing the buying and the selling, they know the figures are fudged too, but they also know how markets will react to the lies of government, so they have to, play the game. But the one thing that they miss is that, first, they don't define inflation correctly. Inflation isn't measured by the CPI, although there's times when the inflation will affect the CPI as it did in the 70s, and they had to admit to it. But inflation is when they increase the money supply, and they're doing this massively. Everybody knows it, but everybody knows that the velocity of money in the circulation is a little bit slower than they want. They actually want it to speed up and they want to devalue the debt. That's the reason they do this. But even in spite of that, there's a tremendous amount of inflation, not only in the CPI that is fudged, the consumer prices are going up, but if you pick out certain things like education and medical care, and if you pick out the cost of a bond and the stock market, there's a lot of malinvestment out there, a lot of bubbles, a lot of distortion of prices, and that's the biggest problem with the government inflating and fixing interest rates is the false information it sends to the marketplace for all the entrepreneurs and the investors and the savers to do the right thing. So in a way, everybody's trying to outguess what the government's doing, and they hope they make the right decision, but basically they're building a house of cards that eventually will come down, probably even worse than we had in '09.
Well, and it's not just the PPI and the CPI, but then the next thing that I wanted to touch on was the unemployment figures. And I'm blessed to have the former commissioner of the BLS, who was a Bush 43 appointee, teach me how to read these reports. So even the unemployment data that we're getting is just simply not accurate.
Yeah, and then they're starting to admit, because they've been hounded, people are dropping out of the workforce, and therefore they're not counted. But now the administration's come along and say, yeah, I guess we have to recognize that. But that's their choice, and that's good. Maybe they think it's in their best interest that they stay at home and take care of their kids. And they rationalize this, and besides, when they stay at home, even if it's not by their doing, there's a safety net there, which is always limited, and that is, well, they're going to get benefits. So that they will concoct these stories, but the real unemployment rate, I think, look at what percent of the employment and the workforce is employed, and that keeps going down. It's down to around 63%. And I imagine that'll steadily go down because they're acknowledging that more people are going to drop out, and we can expect that to happen when the minimum wage is raised, and also the consequence of just the correction that is coming and is demanded by the market, and which hasn't been allowed. When that correction keeps coming, then you're going to see a much worse employment rate, and even though today it's much worse than they pretend it is.
Well, so the deficits are running higher than we're being told. Inflation is much higher than is being reported. The job situation is worse than we're being told. Is this just deliberately trying to pull the wool over our eyes so that we'll go out and spend money?
Yeah, it's all spin. It's all propaganda. And they actually, if you want to try to give them a benefit of the doubt, some people say, well, they do it. They're doing it on purpose. Obamacare is there to make it crash, and then everybody will have to go into a single-payer national health care system. Others actually believe this stuff works because it's been a religion. The economic religion has been Keynesianism, and Washington is filled with it. Most members of Congress that I met don't have the vaguest idea what free market Austrian economics is all about. So they actually believe that spending is good. Now the Republicans will say, well, don't spend quite as much, don't borrow quite as much. But even when they get in charge, they keep doing the same thing, because if you talk to a conservative, they love military Keynesianism. They might not like liberal Keynesianism, but boy, if you can build a fighter like an F-35 that is not needed at all and spend $400 billion, well, that's good for jobs. And that's why that plane is being built in 40 different states, for political reasons. So they actually believe this, that if you don't spend the money, if you don't run up the debt, if you don't continue to borrow, the end of the world would come. Like if they believe that if the bankruptcies would have occurred in '09 and General Motors had gone bankrupt, the end of the world would have been here because they couldn't have recovered. But instead, they prop it up, and what do we have? We have a General Motors that, survives to some extent, but is doomed to fail later on because government is involved. Also distracted from where this money should have gone. I mean, where should this capital have gone? To bailing out these companies and bailing out the bankers at the expense of the middle class. So they believe this, and I think most of it's ignorance of the people who want to go along with it. But then there's a certain level of people who are very much on the inside of the monetary system, the banking system, the Federal Reserve, and there are certain things that leadership of both parties have to endorse, and that is in foreign policy and more monetary policy and in welfare. And, of course, if you believe in the Constitution, if you believe in limited government, you would challenge that. But when push comes to shove, you have to watch, and all this pretense that they're fighting with each other, they really aren't. When it comes to bombing Syria or supporting the Fed, the leadership is always together, both Republicans and Democrats.
You mentioned the Fed. I know your efforts to try and audit the Fed. I'd like to see us in the Fed. Is that the end game in an audit, to expose what they're doing to generate public outrage so that we can finally get rid of that institution?
Yeah, of course, the book is called End the Fed, but the final conclusion of the book is that even if I could in one day, I probably wouldn't think it would be the best, just to close it in one day. And in a way, if we did what I suggest, it might give us a time and prevent it from being closed down in one day. Because when the system closes down is when there's a rout on the dollar. And this idea that the dollar is invincible and the world will always support us, I think is wrong, because that the dollar is, compared to other currencies, still the reserve currency of the world, although weaker than it used to be. So, but when the day comes where they reject the dollar, that is going to crash it. You will see the end of the dollar, and the Federal Reserve will become irrelevant. So, in many ways, I want to end the Fed, but just out of for academic reasons, I argue the case that just allow competition to be in there and let people use something else in a legal manner, and don't put people in prison for using silver as legal tender.
One option be the resurrection of the U.S. note, if we could somehow control its issuance.
What, the greenback like Lincoln had?
Well, or the red sealed Kennedy's efforts, just the money issued by the Treasury as opposed to a privately owned banking cartel.
The only benefit would be is it would take the power away from central bankers doing it in secret, but the principle would still be wrong. You could not trust the Congress to limit the expansion. Matter of fact, Congress loves it this way because they don't have to worry about it. And they like the Fed because the Fed comes in and they expand the money supply to pay for the bills that the congressmen run up and get reelected by voting for all this. But if you turn it over to the Congress, I wouldn't trust them. They're going to keep spending. People have to change their minds about what government should be. As long as the people support a government and reelect the people who think that we should be the policemen of the world, that we should run a welfare state, and deficits don't matter, believe me, you're going to have this problem. The only benefit from what you suggest would be that it would remove the power from a smaller group of people, but then there's going to be a smaller group of people in the Congress who's going to be maybe a chairman of a committee, and there'll be public pressure. Well, you got to expand the money. We need the money. We need these programs, and the pressure would still be very great.
Well, suppose we went back to the Coinage Act of 1792. It had to be gold or silver. And get away with money being created at interest.
That's right. The penalty for violating that law and counterfeiting the paper, you ended up with a death penalty. You're facing a death penalty. So they consider this rather seriously because the paper currency of the continental money, was a disaster for them, and that currency was destroyed, and that's why they felt so strongly. And of course, they had individual states doing the same thing, so it was very chaotic, and they needed something to unify commerce as the world was unified for several decades at the end of the 19th century, and the economies thrived, and that is under a commodity standard. I think that is what would unify individuals, but not to write laws like we have today and prohibit individuals from doing exactly what the Constitution guaranteed that we would be allowed or must do. I mean, it's nothing but silver and gold can be legal tender were the instructions, and yet now gold and silver are prohibited.
Yeah, and unfortunately they used the term to coin money. And that was the loophole that was exploited.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Well, Dr. Paul...
Yeah, they do. The words don't mean so much. If you have bad people in government or determined people, they're going to get around the law. So the law is only as good as the people and the people we represent, and I think that's where we come short.
Dr. Paul, it's been a pleasure. Your people told me when to cut you off, so I'd love to keep going.
All right. It's nice to be with you.
Yeah, well, it's good to be with you, and I'll say hello to Charles when he gets back from Disney World.
Okay, very good. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.